The more compositional these things are, the easier it is to use them. The less you have to glue and program these things together, the simpler it actually becomes, and that people are building more things like that.
Hi, you're listening to The Secure Developer. It's part of the DevSecOn community, a platform for developers, operators, and security people to share their views and practices on DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and more. Check out devsecon.com to join the community and find other great resources. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk is a dev-first security company, helping companies fix vulnerabilities in their open source components and containers without slowing down development. To learn more, visit snyk.io. SNYK.io. Welcome back to The Secure Developer. On today's episode, Guy Podjarny, president and founder of Snyk, is joined by Justin Cormack. Justin is the CTO at Docker and is passionate about software development, security, and the open source community. He really enjoys serving on the CNCF Technical Oversight Committee, helping projects and communities grow. We hope you enjoyed their conversation, and don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning back in to The Secure Developer. Today we have a guest that really comes from more the DevOps side of the world, and we're going to have some interesting conversations about containers and developer experience around this sort of cloud-native world. It's great to have to discuss all these things Justin Cormack, who is the Chief Technology Officer at Docker. Justin, thanks for coming onto the show.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this.
So Justin, before we dig in, tell us a little bit about what you do. What does it mean to be CTO at Docker, and maybe a bit of the journey that got you here?
Yeah, so I've been at Docker for 5.5 years now. So I started off in engineering at Docker. My first project I worked on was Docker for Mac, and that was a really fun project, and it was really focusing on developer experience and what developers are actually trying to do. It was the desktop experience before that was a bit cobbled together, and this was like, let's make a unified product that developers really love, and it's been a really successful product. And obviously we had Docker for Windows since then as well, and we're thinking about how to do it for Linux too. So that was the first thing I worked on, and then I really worked across everything in Docker since then, I guess. I started working on our open source projects, Docker Engine, and the maintainer, and worked on the internals of the Docker runtime and the particularly security things. I worked on seccomp when we first shipped that. So that's a system call filtering to stop exploits in the container runtime. I started working pretty much full-time in security across the whole of Docker, in then enterprise products, but then since the end of 2019, we sold off the enterprise business to Marantis, and we've been really focusing on being really core to our roots as a developer-focused company, company that really focuses on the needs of the developer on an everyday basis and the things that developers are asking for directly, rather than the enterprise products that were kind of top-down sales. We're kind of bottom-up usage-focused. And so I became CTO recently. I've been kind of doing a lot of the bits of that role recently, and this was kind of formalized in me becoming CTO a few months back. So I'm really working with our team on strategic direction, on helping our developers really develop products that the developers really love. But also, I mean, we've always had this thing at Docker that what we do, and if you look at containers in the first place, we took a really deep, complex technology and made it really simple and magic. And that's kind of my role, is to try and help us do that more. It is a really, those are the kinds of things that really add value, is where we take something that's really complex and make it actually really usable and part of your everyday routine. And that's really the heart of what Docker's about and what we're trying to do more of.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a worthy goal, and we'll probably kind of circle back to that and talk about developer experience. Just so curious, so during that journey you described, for a bunch of years you actually wore the security engineer hat, so you went from maybe more the sort of software engineer hat to more of a security engineer hat. How big of a transition did you feel that was, personally? Like, how was that a very different day to day? Was it just software engineering on a different set of problems? Do you feel it was different in the organization to sort of have that different formal title?
It was an interesting transition, actually. I've always been involved in security to some extent. Before I was at Docker, I mean, I've had a quite miscellaneous career in different areas. I've worked in financial services and publishing and kind of all sorts of businesses. So I've always had exposures, and I was an ops person kind of before I was a developer as well. So I had experience from that kind of point of view, but it was definitely an interesting transition. I recommend people should move into security. I think it's a really valuable thing for engineers to do, is to shift into security, because it's something that I think that you bring a lot of background experience from your previous roles into, and the way of thinking about it. And I think security is something that everyone should do some of in their career, because it's really important. And I think that experience of moving into it full time is something that really helps you think about how security relates to other developers and their day-to-day work and what things are important. I've always kind of seen security as a kind of risk management type thing. I guess that's from my finance background as well. It's like, it's not a sort of absolute that you're trying to fix things, and people kind of sometimes think of it like that, which is always a mistake. It's always about trying to handle risks, trying to work out what things are problematic, what things really apply in your situation, what's the bad things that could happen, what are the easy mitigations, what are the hard mitigations that you need to take longer over, and so on. I think it was interesting because obviously Docker's a really varied company that does a lot of different things. We have products like Docker Desktop that we ship onto people's machines. We have Docker Hub, which is a SaaS service. We were shipping like enterprise products. We were shipping security as part of our product. So it was a really mixed and interesting area to kind of get involved in security as well, because it was just really, really varied. That's also, I think there's quite an interesting way of getting a kind of broad exposure to different aspects of security as well.
Yeah. Sounds like it. And I think that was my sense as well, which is like the forcing function of sort of digging into it and really embedding security is insightful. It's good to hear that it felt that way, doing the actual change. Let's focus then on Docker. You mentioned Hub, and I think people are probably well familiar with Docker, as a context, sort of the dominant technology for handling containers these days. You work with probably a lot of companies that consume Docker, and a lot of complaints maybe, or sort of a lot of concern in the ecosystem is talking about how even if you provide more up-to-date containers, ones that have resolved their vulnerabilities and the likes, companies might just not consume those. People might not move along and take the new upstream. There's some interesting sort of ownership or sort of paradigm challenges over there. I guess from your experience, how do you see companies use containers today? Are most of the images public or private? How do they update often? What do you see as the lay of the land?
It's really interesting, and it's changing, and it's also very diverse as well. So one of the public-private thing is really interesting. One of the things we've been seeing is that people are consuming a lot more public containers. There's a bunch of data. We have a lot of data from Hub, but as I was saying in a minute, it's perhaps not totally typical of the whole industry. But so I think one of the interesting, there was a Sysdig survey recently that said that consumption of public images had risen last year from 40% the year before to 47%, which is way higher than anyone I think would expect. So from Docker Hub, we actually see way more than that, because Docker Hub is probably the primary source of public container images. So this is something that we had obviously seen, that people are consuming public images a lot for longer, because we've been probably the primary source of these. But that figures like for images as a whole, so it gives a better spread across people's private repos and their use of things like ECR, private ECR, and on-premise things like Artifactory and so on, versus as mixed in with things like Docker Hub. So I think that's probably a reasonably accurate view. And the interesting thing about the increase is that I remember when we started things like the Docker official images, which are the most widely used public images a long time ago. I think it was in 2014. Back then, the assumption was that people would use these really, as in their Docker file as from Ubuntu, do these things. And for Ubuntu and the programming language type containers, that's still the case, but I think it's the use of things as whole applications that's really changed. People don't do from Nginx and add in their kind of content and config so much. They add configs and content as volumes and by mounts and leave the actual Nginx image as it comes from upstream. And, so this idea of actually using whole image components as part of your application is something that's really been growing in use over the last few years. It's the model that Docker Compose was kind of built around, and that's kind of a lot of people's mental model and their most popular development tool for containers. But it's also just a way of, I think Kubernetes is things like Helm charts also very much reflect this kind of model of just use these components and then construct an application with your pieces in it. Most of it is comprised of existing components, and it reflects really the whole way that software is constructed as a whole now, where there's, every piece of software is constructed out of open source components, whether they're libraries or base operating system or actual whole applications. And the more compositional these things are, where you just take a component as is, the easier it is to use them. The less you have to glue and program these things together, the simpler it actually becomes. And that people are building more things like that. People are thinking of software like that. I think SaaS, the let's consume services model, also reflects the way people are like, let's just consume an API rather than let's build this into my software, because it's just so much simpler and more flexible to just consume an API. It's more uniform. It's easier to understand. It's better documented like that, and those things. So I think that consuming public images is part of that process of let's make software more compositional, and people are better at making units that are easier to consume like that as well. So Docker Hub, I think 20% of Docker Hub traffic is the official images, which are really like the kind of, we built them to make it easier to consume open source software, because really right from the beginning, we saw that people were wanting to consume software like this. And it kind of feeds, I think that the model, a lot of the things we created at the beginning or early in Docker have stuck as this is how you use containers. One of the things that the official images do is we update the software as the upstream software updates it. So, when Python releases a new Python release, it'll go into the Python official image the next day. And people expect that, rather than the kind of model of that people had before with, in VMs and so on, where you install a long-term support version of Ubuntu, and then you stick on the same version of the same major release of Python for a really long time. And then after 2 or 4 years, you might update to a new version and do a kind of drastic change. There's a much easier path to keeping up to date, but there's also an easier path to not updating, because like all the versions of Python are available from official images, and you can choose. And that's also very different from the Linux distros would give you one choice, or maybe they might give you two choices if there was two major versions being supported at the same time. You might get Python 2 and Python 3 for a long time before Python 2 expired, but after that it goes away. Whereas with containers, it's like, well, you have all the tags. Pick any tag you like. You can use anyone.
How do you see then companies? So it's really interesting to sort of see the growth in public imagery or image usage. I guess it's maybe just the aspect of open source really permeating and people getting better at taking advantage of the sort of the ecosystem that is available to them. And as you point out, maybe this sort of compositional usage, or not actually, or I don't know what you call it, sort of like being able to use the image as a whole and just sort of swap the volume. In terms of updates, though, I guess, are you seeing any patterns? Do you track that? Do you track how often do organizations kind of continue to pull down older images, indeed previous tags, or just kind of fail to update, I guess, what they have deployed, despite the fact it's even easier now because indeed they have that Helm chart and they can just pull in the new version? Yeah,
we have a lot of data about this. We're actually working right now on how to surface it to users effectively. And so we're kind of iterating on this right now, because it's something that, which is a bunch of collaboration with with you at Snyk on making vulnerabilities visible with Docker Scan and showing the vulnerabilities via Snyk in Docker Hub and so on. But we're really looking at how to. We started with shipping like you can scan something, but it doesn't tell you. It tells you a little bit what you could do, but it doesn't. We want to really make those recommendations much clearer for people, like this, and really guide them into this is what you should do now. This is and why you should do that. And I think there's a lot of work we're doing both around showing the scan results as things like, well, this if you've moved from here to here, this would actually fix this major vulnerability, which is obviously, so from that point of view, but also just surfacing stuff that we haven't really surfaced before, like Ubuntu 16.04 is going out of support in a month. You probably want to stop using it soon or think about updating, which is Python 2 is something that came up very particularly recently. I mean, Python 2 has been out of support for a while now, but we still see people using it. I looked at the numbers and it's, there's maybe 30,000 people pulled Python 2 images in the last month. But what they probably don't realize is there was a recent serious CVE on Python 3, which actually also applied to Python 2, but this was not really made very clear to people because Upstream don't support Python 2 anymore. So Upstream didn't say this CVE actually also applies to Python 2. They just fixed Python 3. Yeah. Python 2 is being supported in some places, but not others, and it's not very clear. So the Python 2 official image is not being updated anymore because we ship what Upstream ships. Debian and Ubuntu are still supporting Python 2, but last time I checked, Debian hadn't actually shipped a patch yet, probably because they're not focusing on it and supporting Upstream. So you can be pulling images that are not actually being updated at all and might not necessarily yet be marked as even having a serious CVE. There are backports. And we're wondering if we should ship these in the official image or whether we should tell people how they can get a supported version of Python 2. Because I think it's more helpful to say, like at this point, this image isn't being updated. There is a CVE waiting around here and waiting for it to be fixed like you normally do isn't going to work because it's not being fixed. You need to actually take a positive action to go to a version that is being fixed if you're not going to switch to Python 3 at this point. So that it's really about trying to provide more guidance on top of just here's the CVEs about really these are your options at this point and you should probably be doing one of them.
Yep. So it sounds like it's two different problems, right, that we're talking about here. One problem is all the tags are there all the time, and people might not appreciate that they might be using one that they really has kind of outlived its applicability, and they really should be upgrading. In that context, you need to be highlighting that information, and I'm excited to sort of have Snyk help contribute there and sort of help with more intel to inform it. A big part of it is really about how do you surface that to developers, and that is a separate problem to the problem of, hey, I have a very valid, it's the latest version, or it was the latest version of, say, Python 3, but then a new version came about, and you just need to pull again. I think in that problem space, in that latter one, there's a fair bit of conversation about this notion of like a deterministic deliverables versus staying up to date, right? Tell me if I'm misrepresenting here, right? But a lot of people are, on one hand, you want to say, well, when I run the build, I want to get the exact thing that I got yesterday. And so I might want to sort of pin myself on a specific base image or a specific container because I want to know that it's the thing that I deployed yesterday. So it's deterministic and I get no surprises. On the flip side, if you do that, you might get a vulnerable version that's outdated and you suddenly make all of your sort of security updates. You require all of them to be explicit. I guess what are your thoughts on like what is the best practice you advocate at Docker, and what do you see people actually gravitating towards here?
It's a difficult thing, and I think that it's something that, again, we're looking at how to address it. There's a lot of confusion about the latest problem and like was latest a huge mistake, how to really manage it. I think that what we see from the data is that mostly people are pulling fairly generic tags. It's not all, it varies a little bit from image to image depending on the kind of policy of that image, because things like Ubuntu, where there are multiple streams, like people might be on 1604 or 2004 or 1804, we see quite a few people on those streams rather than latest, which is 2004. It's not pre-releases or anything else. And I think that,
but even those are not deterministic. No, if you pull 1604 today and you pulled 1604 in a month, you'll probably get a different set of bytes, right?
Yeah, and there's an even more complicated problem with something like Ubuntu, where you're probably using Ubuntu to pull a bunch of additional packages, and those are not deterministic either, because you can't, when you pull Python from Debian, that's whatever version of Python Debian happens to be shipping on that day as well. It's really difficult to go back. I mean, Debian does have an archive of what package was what on what date, but it's not designed for production use. It's designed as an archival reference, really, and they would not be happy if you pointed at it. So there's actually a whole bunch of issues around repeatability there, and they vary from image to image. So for something where you're just using the image as is, like say you're using Nginx, it's actually much simpler because you don't have to worry about what's inside it piece and what else you've done with it pieces. And you can address it by, you can address images by their full hash to get the exact version. To make that easier, we are going to be exposing the mapping between the sort of historical mapping between hash and current mapping between hashes and tags easier to see in Docker Hub, for example. So you will be able to see how things were updated, which version, if you have an image by hash, what tag this used to be, and those kinds of things, which are not very visible now. So we're working on that at the moment. But the problem that people have with really pinning things is the workflows are still quite difficult around that. You have to, in general, people are doing a lot of commits to commit the hashes back to their repos. And the workflows for those are kind of messy, I think. I think some of the GitOps tooling, so Flux has an image workflow that kind of manages image updates and commits them back to your repo for you. But it's a kind of, and people do use that, and it kind of helps them manage that a bit. I think it's still we haven't made that pattern as easy as it could be. And I think that we need to work on improving the usability of actually pinning things so that people can do it more easily.
Yeah, and if I challenge that a bit, do we want to? So when you I can definitely see from an operability perspective that this type of determinism is compelling, but at the same time, we're talking about a concern around dealing with updates, and there's a lot of upstream updates, and we talked about how official images, for instance, can make it easier for you to just consume something to be good or is blessed. Do we want, as an industry, to instill the best practice to prioritize reducing? Aren't we basically prioritizing reducing operational risk at the expense of security risk of using stale imagery? Because if you pinned the versions, then it means you need to work harder to get the latest updates, does it not?
Yeah. So I think what we actually want is that we want it pinned operationally, because you really want to know what was in production, so you can actually work out why something failed in production or why there was an increased error rate on this version that shipped into prod. And if you don't know exactly how to rebuild that image, makes life really difficult if you want to, play around and see what happened. So from that point of view, obviously you want to know what the image hash was so you can actually replicate it. But ideally you want to be able to rebuild it, tweak it, maybe add some debug and things like that, which is actually difficult if you don't know what every component was. There's a kind of stage one is you should be able to know the hash in prod so you can replicate it. Stage two is you could replicate that, the build of that if you needed to. But from the developer's point of view, you don't want to over-specify this, or you will never update it because it's too difficult. I mean, I think that the intermediate setup we've got where some automated process does pull requests into your repo to update tags is not ideal either, because I think it's the developer doesn't want to see all those pull requests and keep rebasing over them and things about the exact versions. I think we want that to be part of an automated test stage that happens, without actually touching your code. And you want to specify some, or it's like the kind of log file and module configs that we have. We've worked out some reasonable compromises. If the developer wants to say, don't use the version of this before this version because I know it didn't work, but you don't want to specify exact versions of it and pin everything because it'll be impossible to update. You want to mostly have automated tooling manage the updates, and when things work, it's okay to ship that, but you want to be able to go back and say, why exactly did that automated update break? We shipped this security fix into production because the tooling told us to, which is 90% of the time works fine. But what about the time when it turns out that we were relying on some feature that got fixed with this bug fix and it broke our code, and we need to go back and say exactly how do we work around the fix and things like that. So we need to know, why did this version on Thursday afternoon actually change something when we didn't think there was a change? And those things do, mostly security updates are pretty good and don't break anything, and mostly they can just go into prod. But Hiram's law, someone always relies on every undocumented feature of every piece of code, whether it's performance or undocumented APIs or whatever. And some of those things will break sometimes with updates of one sort or another, not necessarily security updates, but security updates sometimes there's something you just can't support anymore because it turns out that it's not securely supportable and you have to fix it. And
and it's effort, right? Sometimes it's also, the maintainers are not infinitely funded, if funded at all. And sometimes it's just hard. I find this whole space quite fascinating in terms of the balance, because it ends up just being an exercise in risk management, right? You have, and it's actually true for log files for whatever NPM dependencies or the likes as well. The NPM ranges are the equivalent, if you will, to a latest or a 1604. So, well, I want roughly this area, I want this type of combination, and you acknowledge that you'd run a build, and then that causes problems because you get stuff you didn't really want, and suddenly something breaks. And the flip side, if you use the log files, you're now stuck. So now you do need to get these repetitive pull requests that tells you, oh, hey, you need to upgrade again, you need to update the log file, and again, and again, and again. You do, and you don't want that. You find yourself automating the merges of those, and then you come back to it's like, well, so why did I even sort of lock the files in the first place? Why did I not just sort of run it again? Yeah, it probably doesn't really have a single correct answer, right? It's just does it boil down to just being? Do you feel there's something we should push the kind of the industry towards, or do you feel it really just boiled down to, as an organization, you need to figure out, do you prioritize, ease of reproducibility over ease of update, right?
I mean, I think with containers, you've always got some ease of reproducibility because you've actually always got the bits you ship to production. So that's the benefit that you've got that you didn't have before with containers. Correct. So I think that you should kind of make use of that in order to make things easier for your developers as a priority. So that, the developers, if the developers use latest and you rebuild frequently, because you also have to rebuild frequently to make this work, and you should be rebuilding frequently, then most of the time you'll get all the benefits and the security updates, and you'll still have a reproducible, okay, this particular hash actually broke in prod, but I can debug it. I can go back, I can go inside the container and take a look. So, that's actually probably the best option, to combine ease of use and a bit of reproducibility. If you want to, right now, if you want to build more than that, you're going to have to, the tooling isn't great to be honest. And I think we can get to better tooling over time that works for everyone, that gives you more understanding of what's going into your containers. And this comes down to the understanding your supply chain and being able to reproduce, where everything comes from. It's really important to understand where everything comes from and exactly which versions of it is. And we're not really yet at a point where you can, take a container in production and work out every piece of source code that went into it. That needs a lot more tooling. And I think that's the things that there's some work going on to try and make that easier and better, easier to understand. But that's I think that's the point that we need to get to, is where it is just possible to go back to the source code for everything you've got and trace how you got it and those things. I think there's a whole bunch of work going on with things like SBOM, which is software bill of materials, which is a metadata standard for describing what's in a container. But then also, so that's kind of taking it from we've got some software, how do we describe it in a useful way? But then there's also, like, from the other side of it, let's put this software together in a way that we understand it. We understand the process we're putting it together with. We know where everything came from. We don't randomly download things from the internet in your software, like commit them to a repo for, get them from source first, or get them from a internal repository where you actually can trace where they came from first, so that people are not just putting things together in a really ad hoc way that you don't really know. If you curl something into your container build, that you don't really know what it was afterwards.
Yeah, where does it go from? Yeah. There's a whole world of complexity here, and I think you make a good point, which is there's still tooling to kind of allow you to make a better decision, or sort of better trade-off, between the two. If I come back to the first problem, right? We talked about sort of the two problems. One is, how do you help me know I need to use a different container image or an updated or make a change? And the second one was the one we just discussed, which is, when do I update versus when do I kind of maintain equilibrium? For the first one of knowing what to do it, I know, we've kind of had conversations about this in the past. For instance, with Snyk, you can run Docker scan, you can find vulnerabilities. And I think a lot of the conversation that occurs, also what you're sort of surfacing or raising, the question of telling you, hey, this is an out-of-date library. There's always a question around this developer experience involved in doing these things. How much as a developer tool, as a key piece of technology being used by developers, pulling down and making decisions around the operating system and the kind of containers that they are going to be using. How do you drive them towards making the secure decision? How do you kind of drive them to being secure by default, versus how much are you just, being annoying and running? I guess, how do you think about, maybe sort of two questions. One is just in general, like, when you think about that balance, what comes to mind around how do you balance it? And second is, maybe even from a Docker's role in the ecosystem perspective, how do you see your responsibilities divided here? Is this really like one continuum? You have to choose where it is, or am I presenting it incorrectly?
We've always tried to, have a model that with Docker's trying to provide security by default, and it shouldn't be something you opt into. I think for, this piece around supply chain security, we still haven't got good answers. We've been iterating, thinking around things to do here for a while. And I think that, with this focus on all developers and I think we're looking at slightly different solutions than we were when we were looking at sort of enterprise products in a way, because we want to make it really, really usable. And usability means you can't really have people just opting in, because our experience is that most of them don't opt in where there's more work. It's you get a very small number of people who really care because they've been told to, usually, and they work for a few organizations where it's really important. But you have to make things just happen by default. We have to build processes rather than one-off things you can do. It's not, because I think that you can't have people have to manually do something every day, or think about it constantly. It's just got to be something that is happening, and maybe they have to help it along sometimes because the processes are not perfect, or they've got to make choices. When do you upgrade to a new major release? Do you do it early or at the last minute or whatever? What developers have to have those kinds of control because they've got other requirements. But fundamentally, security has to be automatic for it to work. And I think the industry as a whole hasn't been great at doing that. I think Let's Encrypt is a great example of actually making security work. And there was some amount of evangelism, but actually a lot of it was really good tooling for example, rotating certs automatically, which was just not. Certificate rotation was manual before Let's Encrypt for almost everyone, and now for almost everyone it's automatic. And that's the kind of thinking about what automated process do we need to put in to make this actually palatable. I think security has not been, like, the security business as a whole has not been good enough about thinking like that. And I think that's something that's changing gradually. And obviously, Snyk is a developer-focused security company too, and that's I think that's the thinking that you have. But I don't, the industry as a whole hasn't really approached it like that. It's security has been sales-driven, not developer-driven, and about scaring people, not helping people. Those things are gradually changing because helping people works.
Yeah, it actually what mobilizes the change. Yeah. And I think I would say that there's also changes on the other side of tooling. I would say, I'd like to think that Snyk had a hand in it, but that also the developer tooling ecosystem itself appreciates now that there's a more than ever, that there's real value and real kind of responsibility and commitment for developer tools to sort of build a certain amount of security functionality in, and indeed be secure by default and not need to opt into it and all those elements. And I think it's just also hard to always balance that against not being a pest and sort of not being, seen as because it's easier to not bother in the short run for a developer, and so finding the right way to do it. And I agree with you that Let's Encrypt was a brilliant technology innovation and kind of a UX experience, and just kind of figuring out the bottlenecks and really kind of help drive, and as well as some business models, disrupting the certificate generation, making it free. So that's another piece of big friction removal there. A lot came together there, and I guess we're for the listeners, the good news is we're working on it on the Docker and the Snyk side to try and help crack this nut, right? So if you have thoughts of how you think this balance should be struck, then do reach out to me or Justin on
we absolutely want people's feedback on security problems, and what these update problems are something that I feel that you definitely haven't helped people enough with over the years. People have grown into patterns of doing things that kind of work, and I think they're suboptimal, and people know they're doing things that are suboptimal, and we really want to actually make these things better and change the way that these things happen. And with small changes and big changes, I think that there's some incremental, let's make things a little bit better, and then I think there's some more, there's some bigger changes as well that probably have to happen after that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, Justin, while we haven't solved this problem yet, I think we're kind of running out of time. So before I let you go here, I like asking every guest coming on the show, one kind of a final question. If you kind of took out your crystal ball and you thought 5 years out about somebody facing the same responsibilities, right? Someone in your role in 5 years' time, but clearly kind of the world around has changed somewhat. What would you say would be, the biggest difference in that person's reality? What would be most easier or harder?
We have already made some progress towards fixing these things. I mean, I think we're just seeing a sort of Cambrian explosion in software, and there's so much more of it, and it's becoming much more diverse. And we need to, in 5 years' time, we have to be able to manage this better, because it's just going to get more and more messy and complex. I think about the sort of shipping industry and containers quite a lot, because I like history, and we're in the container business. And I think that if you think about the container shipping industry, we think about in software terms, we think a lot about containers as these boxes, and I think the first years of the container were all about like, can you escape from the box, runtime security type things. But the value in containers in the shipping industry was not the box; it was the supply chain and the modern industry that enabled that. Everything changed because you could get things from China to Europe fast and cheaply. You could build things where you used a lot more external components and it was more reliable. And we built all the machines for getting them off the ships. We built gigantic container ships, all those bits of infrastructure that we built around it. People think that containers are about the container and the runtime, but they're really about the content of what's in the containers, the things that you're using to build in your software from that reach you in containers. And I think that we haven't made a lot of those sort of industrial processes kind of easy with containers yet. We spent a lot of time thinking about the boxes and those things, and not about helping people build stuff using the supply chain that we've built for modern software. And the Cambrian explosion kind of metaphor, I think someone came up originally with like JavaScript frameworks, but like every area of software, there's more and more diversity, and we've got to be able to manage it. The Cambrian explosion lasted for 20 million years. We've got there's just a huge amount of stuff going on.
It's not going to go away anytime soon. No, I think it's well said, and we focus on the new technology bits and how to use them, but really it's easy to forget that containers are still relatively new to the ecosystem and that the practices around them have evolved. It's not just containers, it's indeed kind of a holistic change of process and culture and means of software development. We have to sort of think about problems a bit more from first principles and understand what's the right way to approach them versus constantly iterating and kind of retrofitting some past processes to address them. That's very, very well said here. Hey, Justin, it was great to have you on. Thanks for coming on to the show.
Thank you. It's been good fun.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. And I hope you join us for the next one.
Thanks for listening to The Secure Developer. That's all we have time for today. To find additional episodes and full transcriptions, visit thesecuredeveloper.com. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved in the community, find us on Twitter at @DevSecCon. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode. Bye for now.